Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 1, Section 4, and the title of this is European Societies Around 1492. Some of these names should be a little more familiar for you, since this is, for many of you, would be your ancestors. But for the political and economic and intellectual developments that we're going to be discussing, these things are very important to understand in helping us understand how our country was developed, some of the heritage of our country, but also what led to the age of exploration in regards to why did these people come here? What led Europeans to seek to explore this whole new continent? Okay, so first we need to understand a little about the social order in Europe. A bit of the culture, if you will. European societies in 1492 are structured by a social hierarchy. And that means a rank, a pecking order. People had their place in society. At the top would be the monarch. Immediately below the monarch would be nobles, wealthy, landowning, powerful people answering only to the monarch. And this comprised, I guess, the 1%, or the top of the hierarchy in European society generally. Somewhat below the nobility would be skilled artisans and business people. By 1492, these people had attained a degree of social mobility, meaning that some business people, such as the Medici family, had become so powerful and important in Italy that they were considered a ruling class, and yet they were business people. In fact, these were the ancestors of the Italian mafia, if you're into gang stories. However, most people were peasants. The 98%, if you will, most people would have been at the bottom of the hierarchy. As we've discussed often already, the basic element of society in European communities was the family. Life centered on this nuclear family, meaning those closest to you, those who lived in the same dwelling, typically parents and their children. The men in a family mostly worked outside the house, and we're mostly talking about agrarian communities. Most of these men are farmers, either growing crops or domesticating animals, or both. Typically women were responsible for the domestic duties, that of raising children, cooking, cleaning, etc. And these duties were rigidly defined. This lifestyle was embedded into the culture and the religion. It was expected that women were to fill these domestic roles, because the religion for most of Western Europe is Roman Catholic. Now, we'll be talking about the Protestant Reformation in just a moment, but the Roman Catholic Church generally dominated the culture and religion of Western Europe. At the top of the Roman Catholic Church is the Pope. The Pope is considered to be the spiritual descendant of the Apostle Peter. If you've read the New Testament, the Apostle Peter was supposed to be the one to continue the legacy of Jesus. There's a statement, he says, on this rock I will build my church, talking of Peter, and he was supposedly the first pope. And so the Pope has the power to make decisions regarding the policy of the church. And that's not just what type of carpet should we have, but what sort of beliefs and basic tenets should the church practice? Should the church wage war in a crusade? Should the church send missionaries to a new country? Should the church impose new taxes? It was very much a form of government. And below the Pope, there were bishops, very much like the nobility in the monarch ruling class. And then the local form of government for the church would have been the parish priests. Priests are somewhat like preachers if you come from a Protestant faith. However, priests in the Catholic tradition serve a distinct role as well. Priests are to be the intercessors. It's a fancy word for saying that the priest is the go-between for parishioners or those who attend Catholic churches. People would speak to the priest and ask the priest to intercede on their behalf to God. So prayer works a little differently in the Roman Catholic tradition. It is the priest's job to interpret the Scriptures for the congregants or parishioners or people sitting in the church, if you will. It is also their job to administer the sacraments. Now, the sacraments, again, if you're from a Protestant tradition, it's a little less formal. But the sacraments essentially are baptism, marriage, funerals, and finally communion, called the Eucharist in the Catholic faith. Now, I mentioned that the Pope has the power to declare war. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. A church declaring war, really? You know, Mud Creek Baptist declares war on Brevard community? Huh? Yeah, that sort of thing happened at this time. In fact, there were 4 distinct crusades, though there was a whole period known as the Crusades. These were Christian military expeditions, specifically to take the Holy Land. However, not limited to simply Jerusalem. There was a special order of the Catholic Church, and by order I don't mean like, Ben, go do this, but order as in, Chase, would you like to join this holy military society? You need to swear oaths, you need to perform rituals, and then you need to go do these crazy things that will probably get you killed. That kind of order. So, a special order of the Catholic faith called the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuits were a very interesting group of people. Like I said, you had to swear an oath. You had to perform certain rituals. And then you had to go wherever the church sent you, and that will be where you spend the rest of your life. Well, there were a number of these people, and they traveled all over the world. And it was the Jesuits who were some of the very first Europeans to explore the New World. In fact, with Columbus, with De Soto, with Cortez, came Jesuit missionaries. These were some very brave people who believed they were on a sacred mission to spread Catholicism around the world. So meanwhile, these expeditions to spread Christianity either by force or by persuasion were going on at the same time as the beginnings of European exploration around the world. Also, we need to learn a couple of names, most famous of which are Isabella and Ferdinand, King and Queen of Spain at the time of Christopher Columbus. Why do we need to know about them? Well, number one, they paid for his journey. Columbus is famous and all. We'll learn some about him, and there's an oatmeal rant if you're into that sort of thing about Christopher Columbus. You should look it up anyway. But also, they paid for his expedition to go explore. And when he claimed, when he put up a flag in the West Indies, he put up the Spanish flag because they had paid for his expedition. In regards to religion, the Reconquista is considered the time where Spain was reclaiming much of its territory from the Moors. That's a group of people living in today Morocco who were Muslim and were waging a war against the Spanish. And so the Reconquista was what the Spanish called the reconquering of these territories. when you take Western civilization, actually, no, well, you can take Western civ, but here at Blue Ridge, you'll take world civilization, or History 111, 112. You can take it with Dr. Foster, you can take it with me, you can take it online from a variety of people. In History 111, you'll learn about a time known as the Reformation. And you'll learn about a particular Catholic monk named Martin Luther. And maybe you already know something about him. Well, Martin Luther was a very interesting person. His dad wanted him to be a lawyer. In fact, his father invested a considerable sum to send him to college and to buy him the books he needed to get an education, which at the time not many people got to have that. And so it's a big deal. His dad really wanted him to go to school. Well, one day Martin Luther was traveling. I don't know if he was going home to get his mom to do laundry or whatever, but he was traveling, and he was in a terrible storm. He was on a horse. Now, if you think driving in a car during a thunderstorm is scary, imagine being on a horse. And it was so bad, and Martin Luther became so afraid that he made a promise to God. He said, if you will get me through this, I'll give up being a lawyer and I'll enter the ministry. Sure enough, he survived the storm. And he did. He kept to his promise. He entered the ministry. He became a monk. And he devoted his life to the study of Scriptures. And he had this problem. He was very serious about his work, very conscientious in his studies. And he noticed a discrepancy. And he began to notice some corruption within the church. And he began to notice some discrepancies in its teachings. And particularly, the church was promising forgiveness of sin in exchange for money. This is called an indulgence. Meaning that if Seth has an enemy and he wants to go kill said enemy, okay, pay the church an indulgence and all will be forgiven. Seth gets away with murder for a few bucks. And that's an indulgence. Nowhere in the Bible does it say, pay $10 and you're good to go. And so Martin Luther had a problem with this. And a number of other things. And as he began to study, and as he began to ask questions, the church just said, well, the Pope has the right to issue decrees affecting church policy. And so in the church's teachings at that time, church doctrine was held on the same level as the Bible. Well, Martin Luther had a problem with that because he, again, a serious student of the Bible. And nowhere in the Bible does it say the Pope gets to make new rules. And so he began to ask questions. And that's one of those annoying things, you know, when you meet somebody who just won't leave something alone. Well, that was Martin Luther. Well, eventually, he laid out his grievances in a statement called the 95 Theses. And he nailed them to the church door. And more importantly, somebody took it and Xeroxed it and made 1 million copies and put it all over Europe. And his ideas spread. And he survived. It's a neat story I don't have time to go into, but he did. He survived. And his ideas became the Protestant Reformation. And this resulted in a divide between Catholicism and Martin Luther's followers who called themselves protesters, the fancy word being Protestant. So if you've ever wondered why your faith is called a Protestant faith, it's because you're a bunch of protesters.
The battle to control the Holy Lands began more than 1,000 years ago. In medieval times, European Christians set out on a series of crusades to try to win back the region from its Muslim rulers. It was a struggle between not only armies, but faiths. Over the course of 2 centuries, from 1096 to 1291, the Crusaders launched 8 major expeditions and countless smaller efforts. Return to the year 1095. The Christian world is split. In the West, Roman Catholic Europe is a collection of small states and kingdoms. To the east, the Orthodox Christian Byzantine Empire is controlled from Constantinople, which would later become Istanbul in Turkey. In the Middle East, Accra is a lively Muslim city on the coast of modern-day Israel. Accra is the gateway to the Holy Land. Just to the south lies Jerusalem, a city sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. In a speech in France, Pope Urban II tries to unite Eastern and Western Christians by calling for them to unite to liberate the Holy Land. The speech ignites religious fervor across Europe. From princes to peasants, tens of thousands take up the cross, as going on crusade is called.
The First Crusade is kind of a hodgepodge. It's not a fancy military enterprise. A lot of people and a lot of common people become involved. It's a great popular movement.
The main armies of the First Crusade finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, nearly 4 years after Urban issued his call to arms. The city's perimeters are impressive. Fortified walls surround Jerusalem, but the Crusader engineers find a weak spot, not in the walls, but in the landscape.
This is actually the spot where the Crusaders breached the walls of the old city. It was the spot that throughout history has been used because this is the flattest area in Jerusalem. In the northern part of the city right here, that's where Jerusalem can only be defeated.
July 7th, the battle for Jerusalem begins. Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders 8 days later. The Christians overwhelm the city's defenders. The battle becomes a massacre. Historians estimate that between 10,000 and 20,000 Muslims are killed. The Crusaders also burn a synagogue filled with Jews who had sought sanctuary inside.
It was seen as barbaric, uncalled for, and it created a great demand for revenge and retaliatory action.
For more than 80 years, the Christians managed to keep a weak hold on the Holy Land. Then a warrior steps forward to conquer and unify much of the Muslim Middle East. His name is Saladin.
And so that was some of the basic story of the Crusades. The Christian armies take control of Jerusalem, hold it for less than 100 years. It is retaken, and there are several more expeditions to attempt to retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. Now, in the 1400s, Europe has experienced the Black Death, a series of natural disasters, a multitude of wars, generally leading to the understanding that life is short and harsh and full of terrors. Millions had died. And emerging from what we now call the Dark Ages, there was a growth of commerce coupled with a growth in population. Many Italian city-states had profited greatly from trade with Asia and the Middle East. If nothing else, one positive benefit of the Crusades was that it opened up Western Europe to trade with the Middle East, benefiting many, especially these Italian city-states, which were often serving as middlemen. When the population began to rebound from these series of crises, towns and cities began to swell in population. And this new middle class of merchants and skilled workers began to grow in power. What we begin to see in Western Europe is a decline in the old nobility. Less importance focused on land and titles, and more importance on trade and wealth. We also see a cultural phenomena that we'll call the rise of nations. Monarchs were collecting new taxes, raising larger armies, and maintaining large bureaucracies. So the functions of government were increasing. And also, the ability of the government to engage in trade and protect its operations were increasing. Since city-states and fiefdoms were now engaging in international trade, the world was growing. No longer were small shires engaged in warfare with other small shires. We began to see collections, conglomerates, alliances form. And with this, nations. Out of necessity, these small city-states engaged in trade with other Middle Eastern countries, out of necessity for their own protection, began to join together. And from this, we began to see the rise of many major European powers, where the old feudal system began to dissolve out of economic necessity. And we begin to see the rise of nations such as Portugal and Spain and France and England. And let's take England, for example. You could argue that there was some form of central government in England for many hundreds of years previously. You could make that argument. However, it was so divided that this central form of government residing in London never fully controlled the entire British Isles. Not until the late 1400s. At which times, again, out of economic necessity and the need for safety, these people began to unite. And we call this time of the rise of nations in Europe the Renaissance. And it's called the Renaissance or rebirth for many different reasons. You could argue this began in Italy with the great influx of wealth brought into the Italian city-states because of this renewed trade with the Middle East as a result of the Crusades. So much wealth came into Italy that these merchants became so rich that they were commissioning great works of art. And so when you think of the Renaissance, we often think of these amazing works of art, such as the Sistine Chapel, Leonardo da Vinci, and the great works and sculptures and paintings and inventions and developments in technology and so forth. And the great renewal of learning. And it's a great time of learning and culture in Europe. But that stemmed from this economic revival that we see from this influx of trade. Now, with the influx of trade and the opening of new markets comes the necessity for travel. Because number one, how do you get rich quick in Western Europe? You engage in international trade. What does that mean? You invest in expeditions that are going to the furthest places to obtain the rarest goods and that will hopefully survive and bring those goods back. But the key there is hopefully survive and bring those goods back. Because if you want to fund an expedition to India to bring the rarest and wealthiest spices back, they'll probably all be killed. I mean, let's be honest. There's Mongols, there's pirates, there's Saracens, there's all these scary people that will probably kill your investment. Literally, with swords to the head and all that. So it's dangerous. It's difficult, so you're going to have a hard time convincing these brave explorers to go out to the furthest reaches of India and probably get themselves killed. I mean, hey, you know, we'll send Wesley. It'll be, you know, you'll do great. Wesley, you can get rich quick. Go to India. We'll see you in 5 years. Hopefully you'll make it. But it could be 5 years before we get a return on our investment, and they're probably going to chop his poor head off anyway. So, good luck, Wesley. convince the people.
I totally lost what you were talking about because I was thinking about something else.
Were we just talking about murdering someone for a couple dollars?
I mean, yeah, you can murder people for a couple bucks. You can send some guy to their death and hopefully get rich. I mean, it's a wonder what money can do. But the point is, it's difficult, it's dangerous, it's expensive. So let's find a shortcut. Because after all, we love some shortcuts. I mean, really, if you look at a map, and I'm not going to mess with them today, it's going to be very simple. Here is London. You are the king of London, and you have an obsession with fancy spices from India. Well, if you want these fancy spices from India, those spices are coming from way over here. And there's several ways you can do that. You can pay an expedition to go overland all the way to India and get those spices for you. And then all the way back to India and bring those spices back. Now here's the thing, overland, well, there's deserts, there's Mongols, there's pirates, there is storms, what else we got? Bad things. Basically, you're not getting your spices, and the guys you sent are long dead. Sorry. Plan B. You can hire a ship. Invest in a ship, convince a captain to go by sea.
Go down around Africa.
Okay, yeah, go down around Africa. But here's the thing there. The southern coast of Africa, very dangerous as well. So it's also unlikely that you will get your stuff back. In fact, it wasn't until the late 1400s that the southern tip of Africa was successfully navigated. And those guys barely survived. In fact, half of them were killed. And so it wasn't until more recent times that anybody was even able to pull that off. So how are you going to do it? Well, you certainly can't go around north of Russia. That's all ice. So you can't go south. And as new technologies, out of necessity, were being developed, exploration was becoming more and more feasible by sea. Now, Portugal really took the lead in this venture. In fact, the Prince of Portugal was so pro-sailing, he was called Henry the Navigator. He founded a special school for sailing. So if Chase was an adventurous person, and he was obsessed with travel, and liked the idea of getting rich, he could go to school and he could study navigation. And he could someday become the captain of his own ship. And he could receive a commission to explore. Now, typically, these ships did not leave coastal areas. Why do you think they stayed to the coast, for the most part?
That way, if they get in trouble, they can just land and try and get more supplies.
Yeah, well, number one, navigation technologies were somewhat limited. Obviously, we didn't have GPSs back then. And as far as navigating by the stars, we were still learning a lot about that. Yet, as technology increased, traders were able to go further and further and further. And eventually, when the coast of Africa was successfully navigated, we were able to reach the Indian Ocean. And what this means is a direct connection to these markets in India. Cutting the time in half of these journeys and making it much safer. Because you see, overland trade had been going on for so long that it actually led to the rise of banking in India, because they served as middlemen, because not many people could make the dangerous journey all at once. They would go halfway, they would trade their goods in India. And so much of that was going on, India became quite wealthy as a result. Until this sailing technology increased. Dun, dun.